Hello everyone, welcome to this tutorial on which tuning to use, high G or low G, that is re-entrant tuning or linear tuning on the tenor ukulele. I think it's no secret that I myself prefer to use re-entrant tuning. I like the high G and I have that on pretty much all of my instruments. I would prefer that. That does not mean that low G tuning is bad. It's just I choose to use high G tuning, and I would prefer to not do both. I can play both, but I prefer to concentrate my efforts using one tuning or the other. And most of the real expert players that I personally know do the same. They don't really go from one to another. My advice to new players is when they buy a tenor instrument, it's usually got a high G tuning on it. It's usually high G tuning, and my advice would be to play that for a while, see if you like it. If you want to try low G tuning, then buy a set and try it, and then try and make up your mind which one you want to play primarily. I know that some people like to have two instruments. One is tuned re-entrant, the other is tuned linear, but my advice would be to try and stick to one or the other. You don't have to take that advice. By the way, the word re-entrant is to do with the fact that the one or more of the notes comes in at a pitch that it shouldn't do. So you'd expect the strings to go from high to low, but that one isn't low. So it sort of re-enters at a higher pitch. Linear just means goes from low to high or high to low, depending on which way you're looking at it. Here's a low G tuning. So played that way, the notes just get higher. So that's linear tuning or low G tuning. I like to play re-entrant tuning, by the way, on all of the sizes of uke. I play soprano quite often. Usually I don't make videos with soprano, but I like to play it. And I have mine tuned in D tuning, but that's not really relevant, but I have it with a high A. In other words, with a high fourth string. On tenor, I don't play concert very much anymore, but on tenor I play it with a high G, and on baritone I play it with a high D. So I have re-entrant tuned baritone as well. Now, I've got 4 reasons why I prefer to play with re-entrant tuning, and I'll go through them fairly quickly. The first one, I like the way that the limited range, so we go from C up to C there, it's 2 octaves, that's all, and you very rarely use these notes way up here. I rather like that limited range. It tends to sound more like a traditional ukulele sound to me. It also fits in a mix of other instruments very much easier than if you've got that low G. The second reason I like to play re-entrant tuning is because I like a style called Campanella Voicing. Campanella is an Italian word. It means sort of little bells. The Italian word for bell is campana. We have the English word campanology, which means it's the art of bell ringing. So it makes the instrument sound like bells. Let me give you a simple example. If you've got in the middle of a piece of music a descending scale, here's a descending scale of C. And that sounds great. It sounds nice, it sounds smooth. But we can play it a different way. Campanella voicing is where you try and play on one string and then you don't use that string for the next note. You go to another string. In other words, you don't use the same string for 2 or more consecutive notes. Sometimes it's impossible not to. For instance, if you're playing on the C string, where there aren't any other strings that are as low, you have to play those 2 notes, for instance, on the C string, D, C. But have a listen to that same scale again. Okay, now here it is in Campanella voicing. I'm going to play first of all the first string, then the fourth string, then the first string again, then the fourth string, then the third string, then the second string, and then I'm back on the third string. Listen again, slowly. And I do a pull off there because it sounds more in keeping. So I'm not playing the same string twice in a row, except at the very end where I have no option. Now that's called Campanella voicing. Now it isn't just for playing that scale. You play the whole piece like that. You don't use the same string twice, and it makes the notes ring together. It's akin to using, it's a bit like listening to bell ringers. The bells tend to ring on, whether it's handbells or church bells, they tend to ring on and blur together. And it can make a very nice sound, the same effect that you get on a harp. The same sort of effect that you get when you have your foot on the right pedal of a piano. So that's Campanella voicing. I've got arrangements and I've got recordings on YouTube where I play the whole piece, many different pieces, using Campanella voicing. It's a lovely technique to use. Now, the third reason is I like to use a Clawhammer. I also like to use a sort of drone effect. Let me give you an example of the drone first. These perhaps should be separated, but I'm keeping them together because they both involve this fourth string, this fourth high string. So let's do the drone effect. So if I'm in the key of G, so I'm using that as a drone all the way through. Fits with that chord, but this chord is a chord that doesn't really have that note in it. But because it resolves to a chord of G, then it works. So it's a chord of D with a G in the bass. And it sounds wonderful. You can see those notes are consecutive notes, but I'm playing them on 3 different strings, so they ring together. So that drone effect, very effective in all sorts of music, including Scottish music, Irish music, and so on. Now, Clawhammer. Clawhammer is a style of music that developed on the banjo a long, long time ago. It's a style of banjo playing where you use the smaller drone string that a 5-string banjo has. It's tuned to the note G. It can be changed, that tuning can be changed, but you don't change it by fretting that string. It's just there. And you can replicate that effect by using the 4th string on a re-entrant tuned instrument. Let me give you an example. Let's play a tune called Johnson Boys. Okay, that's a style called Clawhammer. Let me play you one more. I made a few mistakes in that one. I'll be in the key of G this time, so that drone note is the tonic note, or the key note. Called Worried Man Blues. Yes. So that's a style called Clawhammer, and it works with Reentrant tuning. It doesn't really work with linear tuning, though there is a very good player on YouTube that does use a linear tuned instrument, and it works just great. But it's much easier to play on a Reentrant tuned instrument. The fourth reason that I choose to play Reentrant tuning is a little bit more difficult to explain. It's to do with something called inversions. Now, let's say we're in the key of C, which is by far the most common key that we play in on the ukulele. It's a common key because it's got lots of open strings, and that enables us to do things with the open strings, like this sort of thing. Okay, you can play tunes in the middle of the chord. You can add notes to it. You can add a second to it, for instance. Or a suspension. Now, so we're in the key of C, and what we want to do is play a chord where C is the lowest note, because that sounds finished. It also sounds like the piece has started. We can do that on this instrument just by strumming it, because the lowest note is that note C. It doesn't matter where it is when we strum it, it's still the note that we hear, the tonic note, the key note, if we're in the key of C. On a linear tuned instrument, we play the same chord of C, we hear that note. That's the fifth of the chord, not the root of the chord. So it's actually what we call a second inversion chord. And it doesn't sound finished at all, it sounds sort of wrong. Now, you can play it differently. You can play it like this, for instance, with a sort of umcha sort of strum. C, G, C, G, C, G. We could do this. And that makes the C stand out because you're playing it on the first beat of the bar and the third beat of the bar. Let me just show you an example of something. So, here's the note C and a chord of C, but I can play that chord of C up here. It's still a root position chord. Play it up here. The lowest note is still C, so it's a root position chord. If I change that to the note E here on the third string, that becomes a first inversion chord. And again, that doesn't sound finished. If you're playing on your own, this really matters. If you're playing with others, particularly if you've got a bass instrument playing, a bass ukulele or a bass guitar, it doesn't matter at all because they will handle the bass part. And it doesn't really matter what inversion of the chords you use. Don't confuse inversions, by the way, with positions. This is fifth position. It's not fifth inversion. Okay, because there isn't one. Actually, strictly speaking, there is one, but it's very technical. So that's why I play the ukulele with Reentrant tuning. But why do some people play with linear tuning? There are lots of good players, really excellent players that use linear tuning. Well, it works with one style of music really well, and that's the style called jazz. Now, most players aren't actually jazz players. Jazz is a technique that's really difficult and takes a lifetime to learn. But you can play jazz chords. Jazz chords tend to be chords with more than those normal three notes in them. You can play chords that are four-note chords. It's not really a jazz style, but there's plenty of four-note chords there. So if we did something like this, then that low note sounds more effective, I think, than playing the same sort of thing on a Reentrant tune. hope you've enjoyed this little explanation on which is best, Reentrant or linear tuning, and the answer of course is they're both good. Thank you for listening and goodbye.